Welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English, and we turn now in your hymnals to page 382, 383. As your textbook company likes to do, this anthology maker, they like to pair titles together for any number of reasons, usually at the level 2B, that is to say the literary analysis level. We'll be working now with the Scarlet Ibis of James Hurst and the Golden Kite, the Silver Wind, the text of Ray Bradbury. Okay, we're going to put these two together and study these two together from the perspective of symbolism and allegory. So let's go ahead and write this one down now right away at level 2B. What do we mean when we talk about symbolism and allegory? Now, without question, this is a really important element of how we read below the epidermal level, as I've called it in other lectures that I've given to you. That notion of really trying to understand what's going on with a text at level 2. Let's read together. Works of literature can have two levels of meaning. The first level is literal, what we sometimes refer to as the epidermal, your skin level, right? The text means exactly what it says. In some works, however, the text suggests a second, more abstract meaning. This second, deeper layer of meaning is often called symbolic or allegorical. Let's define these terms. A symbol, I hope you have it written down at 2B. A symbol, a person, a thing, represents both itself and a larger idea. For example, a dove can be a symbol of peace. A voyage can represent the journey of life. Symbolism, let's get that word at 2B, is the use of symbols to convey ideas. Writers may use traditional or conventional symbols that readers recognize easily, such as a rose signifying love. Writers may also create their own personal symbols within literary works. As you read these two titles, consider whether characters, objects, details, or even the setting of a story may suggest another level of meaning. Now, what's this thing about allegory? Let's get that one in our notes. Allegory. A story or a poem in which every element has parallel, literal, and symbolic meanings. For example, in an allegory about a sailor crossing the ocean, the sailor could represent all people, storms at sea could represent life's troubles, sails could represent the help of friends. To appreciate an allegory, consider both levels of meaning. To interpret an allegory, ask yourself what each particular element in a story might stand for. A true allegory will have a one-to-one correspondence of literal meaning to symbolic meaning throughout the narrative. Two observations here. We have pointed out already that when we work at level 2B, our challenge is a two-part dance. What is it and how does it work? So for example, conflict. What is it? How does it work? The use of a simile. What is it and how does it work? In other words, how does it relate to overall meaning of theme, etc., etc. When we look at this notion of symbolism and allegory, we're going to ask the same question. What is it and how does it work? So as we look then at these two titles, these two texts, we're going to be paying attention to the symbolic reading, the allegorical reading. So let's get those notions in your notes as well. A symbolic reading, an allegorical reading of a text, okay? The other thing I want to say really quickly about allegory is that allegory is one of the oldest forms of writing in the Western tradition. One of the most famous allegories comes from Plato, the great Greek philosopher, and his cave allegory from Republic. And in that story, we will have a one-to-one correspondence, okay? And I've given other lectures on that if you want to run that kind of information down. You'll hear more about the cave allegory as you go through high school. All right, let's turn now to James Hurst and Ray Bradbury. And sadly, we have to update your textbook. When your textbook was published, notice the birth dates for both Hurst as well as Bradbury were 1922, 1920. Since this book was published and handed to students at Worland High School and a few million other students in America, tragically, we've lost both these writers. Hurst dies in 2013 at the age of 91. Bradbury dies in 2012 at the age of 92. So right away, let's just say something amazing about these two writers that are there pictured for you on 383. They both are worthy of our respect, if for no other reason. Dude, they lived 90 years. I mean, do the fast math. What year will it be when you turn 90? Just do that fast math really quickly and just get a sense of what that even means to you, how many years out in your future that is. That's what these guys did. And in so doing, they basically lived most of the 20th century. So their perspectives, their wisdom, can we say it that way? The things they're going to share will obviously be important. Let's turn to the first of them, James Hurst, the author of Scarlet Ibis. By the way, just to point out, we do have the big question on page 383, is conflict necessary, okay? I should also say, we will finish unit number 2 out of our textbook with these 2 stories. This will culminate, then finish our 2 stories of the short story unit of unit number 2, where we have been engaging this question, is conflict necessary? Let's learn about James Hurst. James Hurst grew up along the coast of North Carolina, a place of quiet landscapes, violent storms. After studying chemical engineering and opera and serving in the Army during World War II, Hurst took a job at a New York bank. For 34 years, he worked as a banker and spent his evenings writing stories. Let's pause for a moment. This is true of a number of our writers who we study in our high school career. Many of the authors that we study did not start out thinking they would be writers. Many of them, a surprising number of them, come out of the background of math science. It's quite remarkable, actually. The number of writers who came out of math science, engineering often, then got jobs working at kind of what you might think of as completely opposite of what you would think about a writer would do, working in a bank, for example, and yet in the evening writing really influential stories, of which Scarlet Ibis is probably Hurst's most famous, right? The Scarlet Ibis, write it down, published in 1960, is Hurst's best known story. Hurst had said that he, quote, wanted the ibis to represent the character of Doodle, who we're going to meet in the story. Not Doodle's physical self, but rather his spirit. Now, none of that's going to have any meaning to you until we actually turn to the story itself. So let's turn there now, the Scarlet Ibis. Let's say 2 things in advance about this story as we're getting ready. I'm going to ask you 2 questions at the conclusion of this story. 1, the first question I'm going to ask you is, what is the central conflict or struggle of this story? It's the focus of our second unit. We obviously want to spend time there. So in other words, I'm going to ask you, do you see this as an internal struggle, character versus self? Or do you see this as somehow an external struggle, character versus character, character versus nature, character versus some kind of idea or society? Okay? That's my first question. Number 2, we're going to ask about this title, the Scarlet Ibis. An ibis is a bird, scarlet means red. Do you got me? Okay, so right away we're going to ask, why is the story called the Scarlet Ibis? Now, put this in your notes. This is a story about family. So write that down at level 1. This is a story about family. This is a story about brothers. And in that regards, this is a story that naturally builds off of the oldest stories. If, for example, you pick up a Bible and you read it, one of the first stories you hear about is a story about 2 brothers named Cain and Abel. Standing behind this story will be that story. So we're already beginning to kind of ask some questions about what's going on with this story. Okay, now, let's go ahead and pay close attention now and read along. I'm telling you in advance, your tendencies will be to listen and not read this story. I promise you, your tendencies will be to listen and not read this story. It'll be almost like you're thinking, you know what? I'm going to just let the storyteller tell me the story. I challenge you to follow along and actually read all the way to the end of the story, conquering monkey mind as you go, and then we'll work levels 1, 2, and 3. All right, here we go. The Scarlet Ibis, James Hurst's classic. Enjoy the text, all right?
The Scarlet Ibis by James Hurst. It was in the clove of seasons. Summer was dead, but autumn had not yet been born, that the ibis lit in the bleeding tree. The flower garden was stained with rotting brown magnolia petals, and ironweeds grew rank amid the purple phlox. The 5 o'clocks by the chimney still marked time, but the oriole nest in the elm was untenanted and rocked back and forth like an empty cradle. The last graveyard flowers were blooming, and their smell drifted across the cotton field and through every room of our house, speaking softly the names of our dead. It's strange that all this is still so clear to me, now that the summer has long since fled and time has had its way. A grindstone stands where the bleeding tree stood, just outside the kitchen door. And now, if an oriole sings in the elm, its song seems to die up in the leaves, a silvery dust. The flower garden is prim, the house a gleaming white, and the pale fence across the yard stands straight and spruce. But sometimes, like right now, as I sit in the cool, green-draped parlor, the grindstone begins to turn, and time, with all its changes, is ground away. And I remember Doodle. Doodle was just about the craziest brother a boy ever had. Of course, he wasn't a crazy like old Miss Leedy, who was in love with President Wilson and wrote him a letter every day, but was a nice crazy, like someone you meet in your dreams. He was born when I was 6 and was, from the outset, a disappointment. He seemed all head, with a tiny body which was red and shriveled like an old man's. Everybody thought he was going to die. Everybody except Aunt Nicey, who had delivered him. She said he would live because he was born in a caul, and cauls were made from Jesus's nightgown. Daddy had Mr. Heath, the carpenter, build a little mahogany coffin for him. But he didn't die, and when he was 3 months old, Mama and Daddy decided they might as well name him. They named him William Armstrong, which was like tying a big tail on a small kite. Such a name sounds good only on a tombstone. I thought myself pretty smart at many things, like holding my breath, running, jumping, or climbing the vines in Old Woman's Swamp. And I wanted more than anything else someone to race to Horsehead Landing, someone to box with, and someone to perch with in the top fork of the great pine behind the barn, where across the fields and swamps you could see the sea. I wanted a brother. But Mama, crying, told me that even if William Armstrong lived, he would never do these things with me. He might not, she sobbed, even be all there. He might, as long as he lived, lie on the rubber sheet in the center of the bed in the front bedroom where the white marquisette curtains billowed out in the afternoon sea breeze, rustling like palmetto fronds. It was bad enough having an invalid brother, but having one who possibly was not all there was unbearable. So I began to make plans to kill him by smothering him with a pillow. However, one afternoon as I watched him, my head poked between the iron posts of the foot of the bed, he looked straight at me and grinned. I skipped through the rooms, down the echoing hall, shouting, "Mama, he smiled! He's all there! He's all there!" And he was. When he was 2, if you laid him on his stomach, he began to try to move himself, straining terribly. The doctor said that with his weak heart, this strain would probably kill him. But it didn't. Trembling, he'd push himself up, turning first red, then a soft purple, and finally collapse back onto the bed like an old worn-out doll. I can still see Mama watching him, her hand pressed tight across her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. But he learned to crawl. It was his 3rd winter, and we brought him out of the front bedroom, putting him on the rug before the fireplace. For the first time, he became one of us. As long as he lay all the time in bed, we called him William Armstrong, even though it was formal and sounded as if we were referring to one of our ancestors. But with his creeping around on the deerskin rug and beginning to talk, something had to be done about his name. It was I who renamed him. When he crawled backwards, as if he were in reverse and couldn't change gears. If you called him, he'd turn around as if he were going in the other direction, then he'd back right up to you to be picked up. Crawling backward made him look like a doodlebug. So I began to call him Doodle. And in time, even Mama and Daddy thought it was a better name than William Armstrong. Only Aunt Nicey disagreed. She said call babies should be treated with special respect since they might turn out to be saints. Renaming my brother was perhaps the kindest thing I ever did for him, because nobody expects much from someone called Doodle. Although Doodle learned to crawl, he showed no signs of walking. But he wasn't idle. He talked so much that we all quit listening to what he said. It was about this time that Daddy built him a go-kart, and I had to pull him around. At first, I just paraded him up and down the piazza, but then he started crying to be taken out into the yard, and it ended up by my having to lug him wherever I went. If I so much as picked up my cap, he'd start crying to go with me, and Mama would call from wherever she was, "Take Doodle with you." He was a burden in many ways. The doctor had said that he mustn't get too excited, too hot, too cold, or too tired, and that he must always be treated gently. A long list of don'ts went with him, all of which I ignored once we got out of the house. To discourage his coming with me, I'd run with him across the ends of the cotton rows and careen him around corners on 2 wheels. Sometimes I accidentally turned him over, but he never told Mama. His skin was very sensitive, and he had to wear a big straw hat whenever he went out. When the going got rough and he had to cling to the sides of the go-kart, the hat slipped all the way down over his ears. He was a sight. Finally, I could see I was licked. Doodle was my brother, and he was going to cling to me forever no matter what I did. So I dragged him across the burning cotton field to share with him the only beauty I knew, Old Woman Swamp. I pulled the go-kart through the sawtooth fern, down into the green dimness where the palmetto fronds whispered by the stream. I lifted him out and set him down in the soft rubber grass beside a tall pine. His eyes were round with wonder as he gazed about him, and his little hands began to stroke the rubber grass. Then he began to cry. "For heaven's sake, what's the matter?" I asked, annoyed. "It's so pretty," he said. "So pretty. Pretty. Pretty." After that day, Doodle and I often went down into Old Woman Swamp. I would gather wildflowers, wild violets, honeysuckle, yellow jasmine, snake flowers, and water lilies, and with wiregrass we'd weave them into necklaces and crowns. We'd bedeck ourselves with our handiwork and loll about, thus beautified, beyond the touch of the everyday world. Then, when the slanted rays of the sun burned orange in the tops of the pines, we'd drop our jewels into the stream and watch them float away toward the sea. There is within me, and with sadness I have watched it in others, a knot of cruelty born by the stream of love, much as our blood sometimes bears the seed of our destruction. And at times, I was mean to Doodle. One day I took him up to the barn loft and showed him his casket, telling him how we had all believed he would die. It was covered with a film of Paris green sprinkled to kill the rats, and screech owls had built a nest inside it. Doodle studied the mahogany box for a long time, then said, "It's not mine." "It is," I said. "And before I'll help you down from the loft, you're going to have to touch it." "I won't touch it," he said sullenly. "Then I'll leave you here by yourself," I threatened, and made as if I were going down. Doodle was frightened of being left. "Don't go leave me, brother," he cried, and he leaned toward the coffin. His hand, trembling, reached out, and when he touched the casket, he screamed. A screech owl flapped out of the box into our faces, scaring us and covering us with Paris green. Doodle was paralyzed, so I put him on my shoulder and carried him down the ladder. And even when we were outside in the bright sunshine, he clung to me, crying, "Don't leave me! Don't leave me!" When Doodle was 5 years old, I was embarrassed at having a brother of that age who couldn't walk. So I set out to teach him. We were down in Old Woman's Swamp, and it was spring, and the sick-sweet smell of bayflowers hung everywhere like a mournful song. "I'm going to teach you to walk, Doodle," I said. He was sitting comfortably on the soft grass, leaning back against the pine. "Why?" he asked. I hadn't expected such an answer. "So I won't have to haul you around all the time." "I can't walk, brother," he said. "Who says so?" I demanded. "Mama, the doctor, everybody." "Oh, you can walk," I said, and I took him by the arms and stood him up. He collapsed onto the grass like a half-empty flour sack. It was as if he had no bones in his little legs. "Don't hurt me, brother," he warned. "Shut up. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to teach you to walk." I heaved him up again, and again he collapsed. This time, he did not lift his face up out of the rubber grass. "I just can't do it." "Let's make honeysuckle wreaths." "Oh, yes, you can, Doodle," I said. "All you got to do is try. Now, come on." And I hauled him up once more. It seemed so hopeless from the beginning that it's a miracle I didn't give up. But all of us must have something or someone to be proud of, and Doodle had become mine. I did not know then that pride is a wonderful, terrible thing, a seed that bears two vines, life and death. Every day that summer we went to the pine beside the stream of Old Woman's Swamp, and I put him on his feet at least 100 times each afternoon. Occasionally I too became discouraged because it didn't seem as if he was trying.